June Harris had never planned to stay in the suburbs. The silence there felt too symmetrical, like a kind of discipline she had never learned to follow. She had spent most of her adult life in Manhattan, consulting for companies that built ethics algorithms, programs designed to identify moral bias in digital systems. Her work had made her suspicious of order because she knew how fragile it really was once people decided what counted as correct. When her sister left for a year-long sailing trip around the Atlantic, June agreed to take care of her house in the southern community of Lakewood Springs. It was meant to be temporary, a sabbatical from the noise of the city. The neighborhood, at first glance, looked harmless. Pastel facades, mowed lawns, and identical mailboxes like rows of polite smiles. Everything felt perfectly rehearsed. The house itself was small but airy, perched at the edge of a cul-de-sac, where magnolia trees grew in exact alignment, as if even nature had signed an agreement with the HOA. June unpacked her things slowly, making space for her work set up in one of the unused rooms. It was the first time she had heard the quiet hum of insects louder than the city's sirens. She tried to like it. On the second week, she drafted a plan to add a small glass-walled office space at the back of the house, just a few meters of extension that would let her work with more natural light. Out of habit, she checked the HOA's website and followed the required form for construction notification. The form was clear, mechanical: submit blueprints, wait for acknowledgement, and refrain from construction until approval. She sent it and received an automated confirmation email. That was it. Weeks passed, no reply. She assumed it was slow bureaucracy, something local associations were known for, and ordered the materials in advance: timber, insulation panels, and a modular steel frame that was supposed to arrive the following month. She stacked them neatly by the back fence and went on with her routine. Coffee in the morning, data reviews in the afternoon, long evening walks when the sun dipped low and the houses glowed with the same shade of suburban gold. Everything looked so coordinated that it began to feel staged, like a simulation of peace rather than the thing itself. People waved but rarely talked. A man across the street watered his lawn at exactly the same hour every morning, without fail. A woman jogged in silence, her face unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. June told herself she was being paranoid. The first letter from the HOA came in a thick, cream-colored envelope with embossed edges. It didn't look like a warning. It looked like an invitation. Inside, however, the tone was unmistakably cold. Notice of violation. Unauthorized modification of property exterior. The text claimed that she had initiated unapproved structural work and owed a penalty of $18,000 for aesthetic disruption and non-compliant planning. June read it twice, then a third time, convinced there had been a mix-up. She hadn't built anything yet. The only thing she had done was clear weeds and stack materials inside the fence. The letter was signed not by a board, but by a single name: Gail Whitmore, president of the Lakewood Springs Homeowners Association. There was no contact number, only a P.O. box address and a request for payment within 10 business days. Her first impulse was rational explanation. She gathered the email confirming her submission, screenshots of the form, timestamps of delivery. She drove to the small office listed as the HOA's headquarters, a converted duplex on the main road. The front door was locked. A notice on the window read, "Administrative operations moved to internal management hub. Access by appointment only. No phone number, no hours of operation." She asked a nearby shop owner if the HOA office ever opened. He gave her a look that was neither rude nor friendly and said, "They're always around, just not here." That night, June sat on the porch, the letter open beside her, and watched as the streetlights flickered on one by one. In the stillness, something about the place felt rehearsed, like a movie set after the actors had gone home. By morning, the materials she had left by the fence were gone. Not stolen, removed. The ground was swept clean as if nothing had ever been there. No footprints, no tire marks. A new notice appeared in her mailbox. Further unauthorized storage of industrial materials will incur additional penalties. There was no signature this time, only the HOA emblem stamped in silver ink. June felt a kind of vertigo, the quiet collapse of logic beneath formality. The system was speaking to her, but she wasn't sure who was behind the voice. In a place built on rules and appearances, it was suddenly unclear whether the order around her existed to protect residents or to erase them one form at a time. June tried to reason with the situation as anyone rational would. Bureaucracy could be absurd, but it still followed patterns, and she was sure that by tracing those patterns she would find the flaw. The letter demanded payment within 10 days, but there was no bank account listed, only instructions to settle via the HOA payment portal. The portal, when she logged in, redirected her to a blank page that displayed a line of text. This account is under administrative review. Please contact your property liaison. There was no link, no email, no phone number. It felt like the system was designed not to work, as if its function was to measure her persistence rather than provide answers. She opened the HOA's bylaws, which were buried in a PDF dated almost 15 years earlier, and found that the president title did exist, but it rotated annually among board members. Gail Whitmore's name appeared nowhere in the document. She cross-checked public records, local registries, even social media, but found almost nothing. No photograph, no contact listing, not even a meeting record with his signature. Yet his name was printed on every letterhead she received from that day forward. The following week brought a new envelope, thinner but heavier in tone. It read, "You are hereby required to cease all construction-related activities. Continued non-compliance will result in enforcement action, including property reassessment and temporary forfeiture of amenities." The phrasing felt theatrical, almost archaic. June called the county zoning office to verify whether any complaints had been filed under her address. The woman on the other end of the line sounded confused, then hesitant. "Lakewood Springs," she repeated, typing something in the background. "That development handles its own oversight. We don't really see their reports. They're self-managed." June asked how that could be possible. The woman sighed softly and said, "It's one of those special jurisdictions. They bought the land outright when the area was incorporated. HOA governance there doesn't filter through us." She paused, then lowered her voice slightly. "If I were you, I'd keep copies of everything. They have a reputation for being selective." That word, selective, lingered. June began to notice how it described everything about the place. Selective landscaping, selective greetings, selective warmth. Even the weather seemed to obey an unspoken decorum. One evening she took her recycling bin to the curb and found a white SUV idling near her mailbox. Inside sat a man wearing a neon safety vest, though there was no construction scheduled on the street. When she approached, the SUV rolled forward a few feet, stopped, and the driver pretended to type something on a tablet. "Excuse me," June called out. But he didn't respond. The license plate bore the HOA logo instead of a county tag. When she blinked, the SUV pulled away in silence, leaving behind only a faint whiff of diesel. That night she couldn't sleep. The air inside the house felt too still, heavy with an unfamiliar quiet. She went online and joined a small local forum called Lakewood Voices, hoping to find threads about construction permits or disputes. Most posts were harmless. Gardening tips, dog sightings, lost packages. But one user named Pine Guest had left a trail of cryptic comments over the years. In one, he wrote, "Never argue directly with the board. They're not the ones you think they are." Another read, "Check the land deeds. Half the homes are paper structures." When June clicked his profile, it displayed "Account suspended." She tried to search his older posts, but each link redirected to an error page that said "Content removed by HOA moderators." The next morning, June received her first personal visit. A woman in her 60s, perfectly composed, wearing a pale green blazer, stood on the porch with a clipboard. "Mrs. Harris?" she asked with a courteous smile. "I'm Deborah from the Aesthetic Compliance Committee. We noticed some irregularities in your property file." June asked to see her identification, but the woman merely held up the clipboard, which bore a printed HOA seal. "We'd prefer to handle this amicably," she said in a tone that was almost soothing, as if they were discussing a misplaced library book rather than a financial penalty that could bankrupt her. "It seems your property is listed as dual use, which complicates your permit." June frowned. "Dual use? This is a single-family home." Deborah gave a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's what the public record says, yes. But our internal zoning map places your lot within a buffer corridor. There are rules about modification there." When June asked what kind of buffer corridor, Deborah glanced at the street and said quietly, "You'd have to ask Mr. Whitmore." Then she turned and walked away, the sound of her heels fading like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. June spent the afternoon combing through every legal document her sister had left her. The property deed was straightforward, the boundaries clear, no mention of any buffer corridor or easement. The HOA contract, however, contained an addendum she had never noticed before, a single page labeled "Supplemental Rights of Oversight," printed in a smaller font than the rest. It stated that the association retained adaptive jurisdiction over external modifications, subject to internal determination. There was no signature, no date, just the HOA seal. She checked her sister's old emails and found one unread message from years ago titled "Annual HOA Verification Required." Its attachment was corrupted, unreadable. By the 5th day, June started receiving what she thought were mistakes, packages containing items she had never ordered. Replacement light bulbs, mailbox paint, and once a set of standardized house numbers identical to those on every other property in the neighborhood. Each delivery slip listed Lakewood Springs Maintenance Initiative as the sender. When she tried to refuse the parcels, the courier shrugged. "Prepaid by HOA, ma'am. They just tell us to drop it off." The items felt less like gifts and more like instructions. Her house, once distinct with its slightly darker shutters and worn wooden door, now stood out as the only one not yet fully conforming to the neighborhood's aesthetic grid. Then came the 3rd letter. No penalties, no threats this time, only a single sentence typed in the middle of an otherwise blank page. "Further non-cooperation will result in reassessment of ownership classification." There was no explanation of what that meant. June read it under the kitchen light and felt something subtle shift inside her, not fear exactly, but the sensation of being slowly unmade by paperwork. She looked out the window and saw her reflection merge with the dark outline of the street. The immaculate houses staring back like sentinels of some silent bureaucracy that didn't need violence to control. It only needed rules written in invisible ink. The first real escalation began with sound, or rather, the absence of it. One night in early March, June realized that the usual background noise of the neighborhood, the rhythmic hum of sprinklers, the faint whir of distant air conditioning units, even the crickets, had stopped entirely. The silence was so abrupt that she could hear the blood moving in her ears. She stepped outside barefoot, expecting to find a blackout, but every porch light along the street was glowing in perfect alignment, creating a corridor of soft white light. Yet her own house had gone dark. The electricity wasn't just out. The breaker panel in the basement was locked. A metal latch she didn't remember having installed now sealed it shut with a tiny sticker marked inspected. The lettering matched the HOA's font. When the power returned at dawn, it came with another message. Folded neatly under her front doormat was a note printed on heavy stock paper, unsigned, reading, "Maintenance activity completed. Unauthorized access will nullify warranty." June laughed at first, a hollow sound that startled her in the empty kitchen. It was absurd. There were no warranties for private homes, no one to authorize secret maintenance. But the laugh died quickly, replaced by a tightness in her throat that she couldn't quite name. Later that day, she called the local power company, who confirmed that no outages or service calls had been logged in her area. "Ma'am," the technician said politely, "if anyone entered your service panel without authorization, that's a safety violation. You might want to file a report." But when she tried to submit one, the online form wouldn't accept her address. It flagged as restricted jurisdiction. The next night, she heard what sounded like the faint scrape of metal against the siding. She turned off the lamp, moved toward the window, and saw a figure standing by the property line, a man, tall, wearing a pale, reflective vest. He wasn't facing her house, but staring down at the soil near the fence, writing something on a small notepad. When she opened the window to call out, he looked up just long enough for her to catch the glint of a badge clipped to his vest, though the emblem wasn't police or city-issued. It was the HOA crest. He didn't speak, only nodded once, then turned and disappeared into the darkness between houses, his footsteps unnervingly measured, like someone walking in time to a rhythm only he could hear. The following morning, June's mailbox was filled not with bills, but with printed observational logs, each dated, each describing a minor violation: curtains visible from exterior, improper grass length, reflective glare from window pane. She read them in disbelief, the bureaucratic precision almost comic in its absurdity, yet something about their accumulation carried weight, like drops of water carving into stone. Her neighbors, once politely distant, now avoided eye contact altogether. One woman across the street, whom June had chatted with briefly weeks earlier, suddenly turned her head and pretended to check her phone when their paths crossed. Another man waved half-heartedly, but immediately crossed to the other side of the road. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn around her property, a boundary no one wanted to acknowledge, but everyone obeyed. In search of answers, she went to the county records office again, insisting on a full property survey. The clerk hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Lakewood Springs doesn't release full plots," she whispered. "Their documents are internal only. The HOA acts as their own zoning board." June frowned. "That's not even legal, is it?" The woman only shrugged. "They call it a legacy charter. Dates back to when the development was founded. Some kind of private covenant. We've had complaints, but every time we try to audit them, the file gets deferred." June pressed for more, but the clerk shook her head quickly, glancing toward the cameras mounted in the corner of the office, as if the building itself were listening. That evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows, June decided to organize every document she had collected. The letters, the printouts, the strange receipts from deliveries she never ordered. She spread them across the dining table, sorting by date and tone, and noticed something unnerving. Each letter bore a watermark faintly visible under lamplight, an architectural symbol, an outline of a circular structure intersected by a diagonal line. It wasn't the HOA logo. She scanned one of the pages and enhanced the contrast until the mark became clear. The design resembled a stylized survey map, or perhaps a floor plan, but for what, she couldn't tell. That same night, the quiet returned, heavier than before. When she stepped onto the porch, the air smelled faintly of paint. A new notice had been nailed to her front post. The metal plate shimmered under the porch light, engraved with fine lettering. "This property is under reassessment for compliance. Tampering with posted signage is prohibited." She ran her fingers along the cold surface, noticing that the screws were already rusting, as if the sign had been there for years instead of minutes. The following day, her garbage collection was skipped, though every other bin on the street had been emptied. By now, the tension had shifted from irritation to dread. June began to dream of paperwork, endless forms filled with her name, each line demanding a new signature, each stamp pressing deeper into the page until it left an imprint on the next. She woke in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, only to find the porch light flickering on and off rhythmically, too steady to be random. Through the blinds, she saw movement again, a silhouette near the curb, standing perfectly still, as if waiting for acknowledgement. When she stepped outside, the street was empty, but her lawn sprinkler had been turned on, spraying in a slow, hypnotic rotation despite her never setting a timer. The following morning, a letter arrived not by mail but tucked into the doorframe, handwritten for the first time. The penmanship was precise, slanted, almost elegant. Your compliance rating is under review. Non-standard behavior affects neighborhood cohesion. There was no name, no date, just that cryptic message. She noticed a faint smudge of red ink at the corner, as though someone had signed and then thought better of it, wiping their initials away. Her hands trembled as she held it, not from fear, but from the surreal realization that every aspect of her life had been converted into an evaluation metric she hadn't agreed to. When she tried to call the number on one of the earlier notices, a recorded voice answered, "You have reached Lakewood Springs Compliance Desk. Your call will be reviewed for prioritization." Then silence. No hold music, no operator. Just a faint mechanical click every few seconds. She stayed on the line for 20 minutes until the connection cut abruptly. It was late afternoon when she noticed the biggest change of all. Across the street, a house that had stood empty since she moved in now showed faint movement behind the curtains, shadows passing, lights flicking on and off. By dusk, a new mailbox appeared, identical to hers but with no nameplate. A moving truck was parked briefly, then gone. The following morning, a man she'd never seen before waved at her driveway. His expression was friendly enough, but his eyes lingered on her front porch, specifically on the metal reassessment plate, as if verifying its placement. Something had shifted in Lakewood Springs, and it wasn't just her standing. The system had decided to make an example of her, to erase her individuality, one procedural gesture at a time. What unsettled June most was not the hostility, but the precision. It all felt planned, calculated, not random cruelty, but a protocol being executed step by step, and she was trapped inside its logic with no clear way out. By April, the pattern had become too elaborate to be dismissed as coincidence. Each action from the HOA, or whatever mechanism stood behind it, arrived with unnerving precision, as though someone were studying her reactions and adjusting the next move accordingly. June tried to regain control by approaching it the way she handled corporate data ethics cases, by gathering verifiable evidence, cataloging each event with timestamps and physical proof. She photographed the letters, recorded the faint mechanical buzz that came through her phone when she called their office, and even measured the distance between the new metal sign and her property line. But none of it made sense when assembled. It was like collecting puzzle pieces from different boxes, each fragment incompatible with the rest. She could feel herself slipping from irritation into obsession, that thin borderland where reality starts to depend on the evidence one can produce to prove it still exists. One morning, she found a manila envelope wedged in her fence, addressed not to her but to Resident 14L. Inside was a printed summons titled Administrative Hearing Notice. The document stated that a hearing would be held to evaluate compliance deviations, and listed her address among 6 others. The location of the hearing wasn't a courthouse or municipal office, but an address she didn't recognize. 1100 Basin Road, listed simply as Operations Facility. When she searched it online, the satellite image showed an empty lot beside a drainage canal. No building, no signage, nothing. She hesitated for several days, debating whether to go. Part of her suspected that ignoring it would only escalate whatever was already happening. Finally, she drove there one Wednesday morning, heart pounding with that nauseating blend of fear and curiosity that precedes irreversible decisions. Basin Road was as desolate as the map had promised. A cracked asphalt lane stretched toward a chain-link gate, beyond which stood a low concrete building with mirrored windows that reflected the pale sky. There were no cars parked outside, but the front door was propped open with a stone as though expecting her. The interior smelled faintly of chlorine and dust. A woman in a gray suit sat behind a folding table, typing on a laptop. "Name?" she asked, without looking up. When June gave it, the woman nodded and pointed to a chair across the room. "Wait for your number to be called." There were 5 other people seated in silence, each holding a sheet of paper identical to hers. No one made eye contact. On the far wall hung a large emblem embossed into the plaster, the same circular design she had seen as a watermark on the earlier letters, intersected by a diagonal line. Seeing it there in physical form gave her a wave of vertigo. It wasn't just an aesthetic symbol. It was a seal, an insignia of authority that no one outside the HOA seemed to acknowledge existed. After 40 minutes, a door opened at the front of the room. A man stepped out, tall, expressionless, wearing a name badge that simply read, "Coordinator." He called the first name on the list, and the woman beside June stood up and followed him inside. 10 minutes later, she returned, eyes glazed, walking mechanically toward the exit without a word. When June's turn came, she rose, gripping the paper like a passport. The room beyond was dimly lit, with a single metal desk and 2 chairs. On the wall hung a screen displaying a scanned image of her property deed, overlaid with red geometric lines, marking sections she didn't recognize. The coordinator gestured for her to sit. "Ms. Harris, this is a preliminary review of your non-compliance case," he said in a tone devoid of emphasis. "You have been classified as Category 3 under Section 9.4, Inconsistent Aesthetic Integration. Do you understand?" June's voice sounded strange even to her own ears when she spoke. "There's been a mistake. I haven't built anything. I only applied for a permit." The man nodded as though expecting that answer. "Applications constitute intent. Intent without alignment creates conflict. We monitor for that." She stared at him, trying to parse his words, but they sounded like fragments of an ideology rather than a regulation. "I'd like to speak to Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The coordinator tilted his head slightly. "Mr. Whitmore's role is non-contact. Administrative layers exist to maintain cohesion. Communication flows downward, not laterally." He slid a form across the table. "Sign this acknowledgement and your reassessment period will conclude in 30 days. Failure to sign will result in escalation." June took the paper but didn't sign. She read the text. It wasn't an acknowledgement but a declaration stating that she recognized the HOA's jurisdictional discretion over all adaptive modifications to property and environment. The language was dense, legalistic, but one phrase stood out: environmental jurisdiction. It wasn't about her house at all. It referred to the land itself, the soil, the trees, even the airspace above the lot. She looked up to ask what it meant, but the coordinator's eyes were fixed on the screen behind her, as if reading invisible instructions. "You should comply, Ms. Harris," he said finally. "Resistance generates instability." That was the word again. Instability, uttered like a crime. She stood without replying, placed the unsigned paper on the table, and left the room. No one tried to stop her. The woman at the laptop didn't look up as June exited the building. Driving home, she felt a hollowness spreading through her chest, the kind that comes not from fear, but from the realization that the ordinary rules of cause and effect no longer apply. She pulled over halfway and sat in the car, staring at the steering wheel until her vision blurred. The reflection in the windshield showed the empty lot behind her. When she looked back, the concrete building seemed smaller than before, almost receding into the air. That night, she slept only in short intervals, half expecting another power outage or another note. Instead, she woke to a sound she hadn't heard in months: children laughing. Through the window, she saw a group of kids riding bicycles in circles around her mailbox. They weren't locals. She'd never seen them before. One of them stopped, pointed at her house, and said something that made the others laugh louder. When she stepped onto the porch, they scattered wordlessly, their wheels spinning gravel behind them. The laughter echoed long after they were gone. 2 days later, her property tax statement arrived. The assessed value of her land had dropped by 40%, marked adjusted for zoning transition. She took it to the county assessor's office, where the clerk looked at the paper, then typed something quickly. "That's not from us," he said flatly. "The Lakewood Springs district handles its own taxation adjustments." June frowned. "But you're the county. How can a homeowners association change property value?" The clerk gave a helpless shrug. "They submit their own valuations. It's part of the charter. We just record the numbers they send." Back home, she found a new email waiting for her in her inbox. The sender line read, "No reply. Internal compliance." The message contained no text, only a single attachment, a high-resolution aerial photo of her neighborhood. Her house was highlighted in red. The time stamp indicated it had been taken 2 hours earlier. She checked outside, but no drone or helicopter was visible. The image was so sharp she could make out the faint pattern of cracks in her driveway. A chill ran through her as she realized the photo had been taken from a much higher altitude than any consumer drone could reach, as though from a surveillance satellite. She tried to trace the email header, but it routed through a dozen encrypted servers, each terminating in "Tarkwatwo," internal. Something deeper was happening, something structured to look mundane while operating at a scale far beyond suburban regulations. The HOA wasn't just an overzealous committee. It behaved like a self-contained system, an organism policing its own version of reality. June spent hours reading through the legacy charter documents she'd downloaded earlier, noticing that some of the earliest entries were redacted. The only legible paragraph described Lakewood Springs as a model community established under an adaptive development pilot program in cooperation with unnamed partners. The phrasing sounded almost governmental, yet no agency was mentioned. The words adaptive and pilot repeated several times, as if hinting at an ongoing experiment. That night, unable to focus, she wandered the neighborhood under the dim glow of identical lamp posts. The streets were unnervingly empty, every house sealed behind blinds, the air thick with sprinkler mist. As she passed the cul-de-sac, she noticed faint mechanical clicking near the storm drain. Peering closer, she saw a small metallic device fixed to the grate, a rectangular box blinking with a single red light. It resembled a sensor or transmitter. When she bent down to touch it, she heard footsteps approaching. A man's voice called out softly, "You shouldn't touch those." She turned quickly. It was the same man she'd seen earlier by her fence, the one with the reflective vest. In the half-light, his expression was unreadable. "They monitor flow levels," he said, almost apologetically. "If they detect interference, it flags non-compliance." June straightened, heart hammering. "Who are you?" she asked. He hesitated, then said quietly, "Maintenance." For a moment she thought he looked genuinely human, tired even, as if caught between loyalty and pity. "You shouldn't be here," he repeated. "Some of us can still help, but not if you keep drawing attention." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing behind the hedges. When she looked back at the drain, the red light on the device had turned off. Back inside, she sat at her desk and opened the last unopened file from her sister's computer, a folder labeled Covenant Archive. Inside were several documents scanned years ago, among them a list of founding members of Lakewood Springs Development Council. The final name on the list froze her blood. Gail Whitmore, Project Oversight Consultant, Adaptive Environment Division. Next to his name, in parentheses, was a date, 1998. The realization hit her slowly. The association's mysterious president wasn't a resident at all. He was one of the original architects of the neighborhood's design, someone who might not have lived there for decades, or perhaps never existed as a single person in the first place. The title Whitmore could be a construct, a placeholder for an entity that had long outgrown its human origin. For the first time since the ordeal began, June felt something like awe mixed with horror. The HOA wasn't malfunctioning. It was functioning exactly as intended, guided by rules written by people who had imagined a community so controlled that even dissent would fold back into the system as proof of its necessity. Standing at the window, she watched the rows of houses glowing faintly in the night and wondered how many others before her had tried to resist, how many had simply disappeared into reassessment, leaving behind immaculate lawns and empty rooms that looked lived in from the outside. June woke up the next morning to find her house smelling faintly of ozone, as if an electrical storm had passed directly overhead. Her laptop screen was glowing blue, the login field already filled with her name, though she hadn't touched the keyboard. When she pressed a key, a notification appeared at the center of the screen. System access restricted, administrative review in progress. The same phrase repeated that evening on her phone when her online banking app froze and displayed an unfamiliar logo in the corner, an outline of the circular seal she had seen in the HOA office. The association had somehow extended its reach into the digital fabric of her life. She realized that she was no longer just being observed, but managed. Her electricity, her correspondence, even her finances were being processed through invisible filters that responded to rules she could neither read nor appeal. By the end of that week, she received another official envelope, thicker than usual, the paper damp as if handled by too many hands. Inside were 12 pages of citations, each referencing a different subsection of the HOA charter. Obstruction of inspection, aesthetic deviation, interference with environmental balance, failure to maintain psychological harmony. The language had shifted from legal to almost theological, each infraction framed as a disruption to a collective equilibrium. The letter concluded with a demand that she attend a mandatory resolution session at the Lakewood Springs Community Hall, an address she knew to be an empty park shelter rarely used for anything but holiday gatherings. June considered ignoring it, but a line at the bottom caught her eye. Failure to appear will result in enforcement by the Compliance Division. The words carried an authoritarian weight, a suggestion that refusal might invite something worse than fines. The night before the session, she heard movement again outside her house. This time it wasn't the quiet presence of a single figure, but the low murmur of several voices, a metallic clatter like tools striking pavement. She turned off her lights and peered through the curtains. 3 figures in reflective gear were fastening something to the curb, a narrow strip of metal that glinted faintly in the porch light. She stepped outside before she could convince herself not to. "What are you doing?" she demanded. The men froze for a second. Then one turned toward her, his expression blank. "Compliance installation," he said, as if reciting a code. "Road sensors for community safety." June pointed at the curb. "That's not community property. That's my frontage." The man tilted his head as though processing a difficult concept. "Perimeter zones are fluid under adaptive governance," he replied flatly, before returning to his work. When she threatened to call the police, none of them reacted. One simply said, "Law enforcement integration pending." They finished their task, collected their tools, and left without a word. At the session the next day, only 7 people attended, seated in a semicircle of metal chairs. Deborah, the woman from the so-called aesthetic committee, stood at the front holding a folder. She greeted each attendee with a smile that seemed rehearsed to the second. When June's turn came, Deborah addressed her with a tone of maternal disappointment. "We've reviewed your behavioral metrics," she began. "The data indicates escalating resistance. That's not sustainable, for you or for us." June tried to laugh, but her throat was too dry. "You can't fine people for existing," she said. Deborah's expression softened, as though she were speaking to a frightened child. "It's not about fines. It's about stability. Lakewood Springs was built to harmonize environmental and emotional structures. People who don't adapt create turbulence." The other residents watched silently, their faces expressionless. One man in a beige sweater raised his hand. "She's the one with the lights," he said, voice trembling slightly. "The irregular pattern at night." Deborah nodded sympathetically. "Yes, we've logged that anomaly." She turned back to June. "The good news is we can recalibrate your status. A brief assessment, maybe 2 sessions at the integration office, and all this can go away." June stood so quickly that her chair screeched against the floor. "I'm not participating in whatever this is," she said, the words shaking but clear. "I know about the charter, the Basin Road facility, the surveillance. You're not a homeowners association. You're an experiment that got out of control." Deborah's smile didn't falter, but something flickered behind her eyes, a flash of genuine alarm. Then she said softly, "Ms. Harris, please be careful with your words. Some of us are only allowed to hear certain things once." She left the hall to find that her car wouldn't start. The dashboard lights blinked erratically, then died. By the time she reached home on foot, the metal plate on her front post had been replaced with a new one engraved in red letters: "Non-cooperative resident, active observation." That night, she noticed that the street lamps no longer lit her section of the road. Her house sat in a pocket of darkness while the rest of the neighborhood glowed in perfect symmetry. The shadows felt alive, folding inward like a tide. The next morning, a courier delivered a thick envelope labeled "Emergency Compliance Agreement." Inside was a printed statement offering her an opportunity to resolve outstanding disputes through voluntary reintegration. It required her to sign away temporary jurisdictional control of her property for maintenance and stabilization. She tore the papers in half and threw them into the trash. Minutes later, her phone vibrated with a message, "Non-acceptance recorded." She felt a sudden surge of anger so pure it cleared her thoughts. If they wanted her to yield, she would confront them directly. June drove to the HOA's listed headquarters again, the duplex on the main road that was always locked. This time, the door stood ajar. The interior was stripped bare, only dust outlines where furniture had once stood. In the center of the floor lay a single object, a bronze nameplate reading Gail Whitmore, President. She picked it up and turned it over. Scratched into the back was a short inscription, "Continuity requires anonymity." The words sent a cold ripple through her spine. As she replaced the plate, she noticed something under the dust, a faint square of cleaner floor, exactly the size of a small table. The missing table from the Basin Road office. The realization hit her with nauseating clarity. The locations, the personnel, the entire infrastructure of the HOA were modular, moved like interchangeable parts of a machine designed to replicate itself wherever necessary. That evening, as the sky turned the color of wet ash, she heard a car pull into her driveway. A man in a dark suit stepped out, holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Harris," he said calmly, "I'm here on behalf of the Community Adjustment Committee. May I come in?" His tone was polite but empty, the kind of voice that didn't invite refusal. June stayed in the doorway. "Do you have a warrant?" she asked. The man smiled faintly. "Warrants are for jurisdictions. We operate by consent." He handed her a sheet of paper printed with her own signature, copied perfectly from an earlier form she'd signed months ago when she moved in. At the bottom, the date had been changed. "This gives us temporary access for recalibration," he explained. June stared at the paper, her pulse hammering. "That's a forgery." "No," he said gently. "It's continuity." When she refused to let him in, he nodded as if that too were acceptable. "Non-entry logged," he said, writing something on the clipboard. "Expect procedural follow-up." Then he returned to his car and drove away, leaving her in the doorway clutching the paper that bore her own falsified consent. For the rest of that week, Lakewood Springs transformed into something colder. The lawns stayed green, the air stayed still, but every day brought a new sign of erasure. Her mail stopped arriving altogether. Her name vanished from the residence directory. Delivery drivers ignored her address entirely. Once, she tried to flag one down, but he stared at her with polite confusion, as if seeing an empty house where she stood. By the weekend, her water pressure dropped to a trickle, the pipes hissing like a quiet warning. Late Sunday night, she heard the hum of an engine idling outside. When she looked through the window, she saw 3 black SUVs parked along the curb, their headlights off, but engines running. No one stepped out. They stayed for exactly 15 minutes, then drove away in unison. The next morning, a thin layer of gray dust covered her porch, fine and uniform, as though sifted there deliberately. On the surface, someone had drawn the same diagonal circle symbol with a single gloved finger. June wiped it away, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Whatever this system was, it had stopped pretending to be administrative. It had crossed into something else, an intelligence that treated her defiance not as rebellion, but as data to be corrected. By the time May arrived, June's house had become an island, not metaphorically but almost physically detached from the rhythm of the community. The street lamps no longer illuminated her property. The air around it carried a faint metallic hum, and the ground near the fence emitted a vibration she could feel through the soles of her shoes. The association had turned absence into punishment. No one spoke to her, no notices arrived, and yet she knew the process was still unfolding somewhere behind the silence. She kept the television on for company, though the signal had begun to distort at irregular intervals, fragments of static revealing flashes of imagery she didn't recognize. Faces, frozen mid-expression, office ceilings, blurred conference tables. She told herself it was interference, but the interruptions came only on one channel, the local Lakewood network. One night, as she sat on the couch surrounded by piles of documents, the broadcast flickered again, and for a second she saw a familiar image, a live aerial view of her own street, time-stamped with the current date and time. The shot zoomed slowly toward her house until it filled the entire frame, then went dark. The next morning she made the decision to bring everything to the courthouse downtown. She no longer trusted email or phone calls, so she printed every document, photograph, and time-stamped note she'd collected, stacking them into 2 heavy folders. The courthouse clerk, a young man barely out of college, listened politely as she explained the situation, his expression gradually shifting from confusion to unease. When she showed him the letters and the reassessment plate photographs, he frowned. "Lakewood Springs," he said, reading the header. "That's an independent jurisdiction. They file their own enforcement actions. But if what you're saying is true, they're overstepping by a mile." He promised to pass her materials to a judge for review and gave her a receipt. It felt almost anticlimactic, the mechanical process of sliding evidence across a counter after weeks of psychological siege. She left the courthouse lighter, almost hopeful, as though returning to the realm of rules might restore the world's geometry. 2 days later, she received a summons, not from the HOA this time, but from the county court itself. The document named Lakewood Springs Homeowners Association as the respondent in a judicial review hearing. For the first time, someone official had acknowledged that the entity could be challenged. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday at 9 a.m. She didn't sleep the night before, pacing the living room, rehearsing every sentence she might need to say. The house felt watchful. When she entered the courtroom, she expected a lawyer or representative from the HOA, but the table opposite her was empty. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a calm, methodical demeanor, adjusted her glasses and asked, "Is the respondent present?" The clerk shook his head. "No filings, Your Honor." The judge nodded slowly, then turned to June. "You may proceed." June explained everything: the letters, the Basin Road facility, the illegal monitoring, the self-issued fines. She presented her folders, and the judge leafed through them carefully, occasionally pausing to read a line aloud. When she reached the page containing the aerial photo, she raised her eyebrows. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "It was sent to me directly," June answered. The judge set it aside, face down, and sighed. "Ms. Harris, I've handled hundreds of municipal cases, but I've never seen a homeowners association attempt to assume this level of authority. Some of these documents reference ordinances that don't even exist." As she spoke, the clerk interrupted, holding a printed sheet just handed to him by an aide. He whispered something to the judge, who frowned and asked him to read it aloud. The message was brief. "All Lakewood Springs filings rescinded. Entity dissolved by administrative order. Existing properties under temporary receivership." For a moment, no one moved. June felt the air leave her lungs. "Dissolved?" she repeated. The judge nodded slowly, as though trying to understand it herself. "That's what it says. Effective immediately." She tapped her pen against the desk. "It appears your problem has resolved itself, Ms. Harris." But it didn't feel resolved. It felt orchestrated, like a magician's flourish meant to conceal the mechanism behind the trick. After the hearing, she drove straight to Lakewood Springs, heart pounding. The neighborhood looked unchanged at first: immaculate lawns, identical houses, perfect stillness. But as she turned onto her street, she saw that half the homes had their blinds drawn and front doors propped open, as though abandoned mid-afternoon. The metal signs had been removed, leaving faint outlines on the posts. Even the hum beneath the ground had ceased. She parked in front of her house and stepped out into a silence so absolute it felt pressurized. On her porch lay one final envelope, heavier than the rest. Inside was a single page bearing the HOA seal and a brief note typed in bold font. "Transfer complete. Compliance achieved through absorption. Thank you for your participation." No signature, no return address. The phrase "through absorption" echoed in her mind with the dull gravity of something irreversible. She looked around, the streets, the manicured hedges, the still windows, and noticed that some of the houses seemed subtly altered. Door frames a few inches wider, roof lines adjusted by degrees, as if the neighborhood itself had reconfigured during her absence. That night, she wandered through the empty cul-de-sac until she reached the storm drain where she had once seen the blinking sensor. It was gone now, replaced by smooth concrete. Above her, the stars looked sharper than usual, too precise, as if etched into glass. She realized with slow horror that there were no insects, no sound of air conditioners, not even the faint rustle of leaves. The environment had reached its purest form of stability. absolute stillness. She thought of what Deborah had said about harmony and turbulence, about recalibration. Perhaps the dissolution of the HOA was not destruction, but completion, the final stage of an experiment whose outcome required silence. When she returned home, the porch light turned on automatically for the first time in weeks. She hesitated at the threshold, feeling the faint pulse of electricity under her feet. Inside, everything was immaculate. The torn papers, the scattered notes, the evidence, all gone. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and new paint. On the dining table sat a small black device no larger than a book, its surface engraved with the diagonal circle symbol. A single light blinked softly at its center, steady and rhythmic. June stood staring at it until the realization came not as fear, but as acceptance. Whatever the HOA had been, whatever system it represented, it had learned everything it needed from her. And now, it was finished. In the following weeks, Lakewood Springs became a ghost of itself. The lawns still gleamed, the mailboxes shone, but the life inside the houses seemed suspended, paused somewhere between existence and display. June stayed, not out of courage, but because there was nowhere else she trusted to be real. Each morning she woke to the same immaculate light pouring through spotless windows, the same faint hum beneath the floor, the same stillness that no longer frightened her but lulled her into a state of quiet vigilance. The county eventually sent inspectors to assess transition conditions, men in plain clothes who moved methodically from house to house, taking photographs without expression. When she asked one of them if the residents were returning, he said, "They never left," and kept walking. At night she heard footsteps that didn't belong to her. Sometimes a door would click softly somewhere down the hall, followed by the subtle shift of air, as if someone were moving within the walls. She stopped turning on the lights. The darkness made it easier to pretend that she was alone. Her neighbors' houses remained lit at all hours, but through the windows she saw only silhouettes, human outlines frozen in domestic gestures, unmoving, perfectly composed like mannequins in a diorama of suburban calm. She no longer knocked or called out. The illusion had settled too deep to disturb. The courthouse sent her a certified letter confirming that the HOA case had been closed, the entity struck from all public registries. Her name, however, was missing from the official record of the hearing. In the transcript she was referred to only as Resident 14L. It didn't surprise her. She had become part of the system's language, absorbed into its taxonomy of order. The realization no longer terrified her. It felt almost inevitable, the way gravity feels when one stops struggling against it. One evening, as the sun dissolved into a perfect orange line beyond the rooftops, she walked to the edge of the neighborhood. The road that once led to the highway now ended in a freshly planted garden bordered by a low white fence. There was no trace of the old asphalt, no sign that a road had ever existed. Beyond the fence stretched a vast field of identical homes receding into the horizon, each marked by the faint glow of synchronized porch lights. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, figures walking in unison between the houses, their paths crossing and merging like strands in a living grid. Then the lights dimmed, and the illusion folded back into stillness. When she returned to her own house, the black device on the dining table was gone, leaving behind only a faint circular imprint on the wood. The air inside felt lighter, as though the pressure that had held her suspended had finally released. She stood by the window and watched the lamppost outside blink once, twice, then steady itself into the same flawless rhythm as every other light on the street. Somewhere deep inside, she understood that the system hadn't disappeared. It had simply achieved equilibrium. The neighborhood no longer needed supervision. It had learned to govern itself. June sat down at the table and whispered into the silence, "You can stop watching now." The room didn't answer. but the hum beneath the floor deepened briefly, almost like a sigh of relief, before fading into perfect quiet. She stayed there until the morning light filled the room, realizing that peace, in its most absolute form, could feel indistinguishable from disappearance.